Hi folks, welcome to this video which shows you how to adjust the allowance account that we have for inventory. So some of the rules you need to remember is that whenever the net realizable value of the inventory is less than cost, you need to have a balance in the allowance account. So it's either going to, so it should be a credit balance, right? And that speaks to the fact that the allowance can only have a zero balance or a credit balance. Its final balance can never be debit. It can be debited, but it can never have a debit balance. So using those rules, when we look at each of these following 4 years here, the objective here is to state the inventory at the lower of cost and net realizable value. And to do that, we're going to make journal entries to adjust it to the lower of the two. And we're going to assume that we're using an allowance method, again using the indirect method. Okay, so in this case, we have a cost of $188,000 and an NRV, net realizable value of $176,000. Well, if the inventory is sitting at cost and our NRV is 176, don't forget when we use the allowance under the indirect method, we have to state our inventory at cost and deduct the balance in the allowance account to set it to net realizable value. So in this case, what we'll need to do is we're going to need to have $12,000 in the allowance because it's sitting at cost and we want it to sit $12,000 lower at net realizable value. So right now, if you look at the balance in the allowance, we have a zero balance in it. We need to have a $12,000 balance. That's what these numbers are telling us. So the amount that we need to have in the allowance account is the ending balance, the difference between cost and net realizable value. So that means at the end of 2016, to make that so, we have to make an adjustment to the allowance to credit it $12,000, to take it from zero to $12,000. So we're going to debit the loss and credit the allowance account for $12,000. Okay, so what does the balance sheet look like now? Well, at the end of 2016, we would again, because we're using the allowance method, show the inventory at cost, less what's in the allowance account. This isn't the adjustment. This is the final balance here. This is the December 31st balance, $12,000. So we're taking that from this number here. Now, if we go into 2017, we have inventory at cost, $194,000, and NRV is less than cost. So we need to have the difference between these two numbers in the allowance account. Well, right now we have a $12,000 credit balance. We need to have a $7,000 credit balance at the end of 2017. So the only way to take it from $12,000 to $7,000 is to debit the allowance. So therefore we're going to debit the allowance for $5,000 in 2017, and we're going to credit not the loss account but a recovery of any previous losses we've had. So far, based on the data we have, we know we've only had a $12,000 loss. So this basically tells us that we're recovering $5,000 of that previous $12,000 that we set up as a loss in 2016. So now, if we have $7,000 left in it, if we were doing the statement of financial position, we have our inventory at cost. We know its cost from here, less the amount we require to have in the allowance, our ending balance, which is $7,000. And that's going to give us our inventory at lower of cost and net realizable value of $187,000, which is what we know it should be over here. Now, at December 31st, 2018, we have a different situation. The situation here is that cost is already less than net realizable value. So our inventory is already sitting at the lower of cost and net realizable value. Because of that, because cost is already less than net realizable value, we don't need anything in the allowance. Remember we said before, it's only when the NRV is less than cost that we need to have a balance in the allowance. Right now, cost is less than NRV, so we need a zero balance. But you'll remember at the end of 2017, we had a credit balance of $7,000. We can see that here. To get it to zero, which is what we require at the end of 2018, we're going to debit the allowance. So at December 2018, we're going to debit the allowance and credit the recovery by $7,000. Okay, and that gives us what we need. So again, when we know to make the adjustment to get it to zero, we need to debit the allowance. We're going to make that journal entry to debit the allowance, credit the recovery, and this is our final balance in the allowance. Therefore, our presentation on the statement of financial position changes a little bit. I don't need to have inventory at cost less the allowance because I have nothing in the allowance. So you'll notice here I've just got my inventory stated at the lower of cost and net realizable value of $173,000. It doesn't make sense to show a zero balance account if there's nothing in it. So now here I am at the end of 2019, and I have cost of 182 and an NRV of 180. I need something in the allowance now because according to my rule, NRV at 180 is less than cost at 182. How much do I need to have? The difference between those two amounts, which is $2,000 credit. Well, we know that at the end of 2018 we had nothing in it. So in order to get our $2,000 balance, we need to make an adjustment of $2,000 to credit the allowance. So what we would do is we would go back to 2019, debit the loss, and credit the allowance for $2,000. This is the credit entry here that we would post to bring it to the balance that we know we need. It's this balance here that we put in the statement of financial position to take the inventory from cost to its net realizable value. So this concludes this video on using the allowance or adjusting the allowance when you're using the indirect method. I hope you found it helpful.